Rowan Cross had never wanted to be at a party less in his entire life, and that included his own surprise 30th birthday celebration, where his mother had hired a clown. The Interstellar Cooperation Summit's opening gala sprawled across the grand ballroom of Europa Station, like some kind of diplomatic fever dream. All glittering chandeliers powered by fusion cores and guests whose biology required 17 different atmospheric mixtures, carefully regulated by the overhead ventilation system he'd personally calibrated last month. He should have felt proud. Instead, he felt trapped. "You need to circulate," his supervisor had insisted earlier, practically shoving him into his formal uniform. "Make connections, show your face. The brass needs to know we have competent people down in environmental systems." What the brass actually needed, Rowan thought as he pressed himself against the viewport overlooking Jupiter's perpetual storm, was for someone to fix the carbon scrubber imbalance in Section 7 before it triggered another false contamination alarm. But no, here he stood with a drink that tasted vaguely like aluminum and regret, watching diplomats from 17 different civilizations pretend to enjoy each other's company, while navigating the complex ballet of not accidentally insulting someone's religious customs or respiratory requirements. A Thromalian delegate glided past, their crystalline body refracting the light into rainbow patterns that would have been beautiful if Rowan hadn't known that their waste products were currently backing up in the bioprocessing unit, because nobody had bothered to update the chemical tolerance parameters. He made a mental note to fix that tomorrow, assuming he survived tonight without dying of boredom. The crowd shifted like a living thing, flowing around conversational clusters and drifting toward the refreshment stations, where server bots offered delicacies ranging from earth chocolates to what appeared to be glowing moss arranged on platinum serving dishes. Rowan had tried one earlier and spent 10 minutes convinced his tongue had gone numb before realizing that was apparently the intended effect. He'd stuck to water since then, though even that had been processed through alien-compatible filtration systems that made it taste oddly flat. He was contemplating the mathematical probability of successfully escaping within the next 15 minutes when his gaze drifted across the hall and stopped dead. She stood perhaps 50 meters away, surrounded by a cluster of officials whose elaborate uniforms suggested importance that Rowan's engineering brain couldn't quite categorize. But he barely noticed them. She wore something that flowed like liquid midnight, her black hair falling in a cascade that caught the light with each subtle movement, and her skin was pale enough that she seemed to gather the ambient glow of the room itself. Then she turned slightly, responding to something one of her companions said, and Rowan saw her ears, elegant and elongated, sweeping back from her skull in graceful points that marked her as beautifully, distinctly other. Their eyes met across the impossible distance of the crowded ballroom, and for a heartbeat that stretched into something larger than time, the noise and chaos around them seemed to fade into irrelevance. She had eyes that reminded him of deep space, dark and infinite, and containing multitudes he couldn't begin to name. Rowan felt suddenly, acutely aware that he was staring like an idiot at a complete stranger who was almost certainly someone important, someone who moved in circles so far above his pay grade that they might as well exist in different dimensions. Do something normal, his panicking brain suggested. Don't just stare. So he smiled. Not the practiced diplomatic smile he'd seen plastered on every face around him tonight, but the kind of genuine, slightly awkward smile he'd give to someone who looked as out of place at a party as he felt. A smile of solidarity, of shared understanding across the void of uncomfortable social situations. A smile that said, "I see you there, fellow sufferer of formal events." Her expression shifted in a way he couldn't quite read, her eyes widening fractionally, and then she smiled back. Except her smile wasn't awkward or sympathetic. It was radiant and certain, carrying a weight of meaning that made Rowan's breath catch in his chest for reasons he couldn't articulate. It was the kind of smile that suggested she'd found something she'd been searching for, though that made no sense because they'd never met and probably existed in completely different social universes, and someone bumped into him from behind. A harried-looking assistant carrying a tray of those glowing moss appetizers and stammering apologies in 3 languages simultaneously. Rowan assured them it was fine, no harm done, and when he looked back across the hall, the woman had turned away to address one of her companions. The moment had passed, dissolving into the general chaos of the gala as if it had never existed. Rowan finished his metallic-tasting drink and checked his chronometer. He'd been here for 63 minutes, which was technically enough to satisfy his supervisor's definition of showing face. Time to escape back to the blessed, comprehensible world of atmospheric processors and coolant flow rates, where things made sense and followed predictable patterns. He deposited his glass on a passing server bot's tray and navigated toward the exit, weaving between clusters of dignitaries discussing trade agreements and territorial disputes, with the kind of intense diplomacy that made engineering problems seem refreshingly straightforward. The corridor outside the ballroom felt blessedly quiet, the thick sound-dampening walls reducing the party to a distant murmur. Rowan's quarters were in the residential ring, a 20-minute walk through the station's main thoroughfare, and he'd never been more grateful for the solitude of late-night corridors, where the only other occupants were maintenance bots performing their scheduled rounds. He spent the walk mentally composing his maintenance schedule for tomorrow, prioritizing the carbon scrubber issue and that persistent coolant leak in Junction 12 that nobody else seemed to notice, but that would definitely become a problem if left unaddressed. There was something deeply comforting about problems that had clear solutions, issues that could be resolved with the right tools and sufficient understanding of the underlying systems. Unlike people, machines were logical. Unlike social situations, engineering made sense. His quarters were small but functional, the way he preferred them: a sleeping alcove, a desk currently buried under technical manuals and data tablets, and a viewport showing the curve of Europa's icy surface below with Jupiter looming massive in the background. He'd paid extra in his housing stipend for that viewport, and it was worth every credit for moments like this when he could decompress after forced socialization by staring at the indifferent beauty of planetary mechanics. Rowan pulled off his formal uniform with relief, trading it for the comfortable worn jumpsuit he wore during off-hours, and settled at his desk to review the maintenance reports that had accumulated during his absence. Atmospheric processing in Section 7 showing predicted decline in efficiency. Check. Bioprocessing unit flagged for chemical parameter updates. Check. Someone had apparently spilled something corrosive in one of the public observation decks, and the cleaning bots needed manual override authorization to use the appropriate solvents, which seemed like a tomorrow problem. He worked until his eyes started to blur, then collapsed into his sleeping alcove with the satisfaction of a day survived and tomorrow's problems neatly categorized. The woman from the party flickered through his thoughts briefly. That smile, those eyes. But he dismissed it as the kind of fleeting encounter that meant nothing in the grand scheme of existence. Ships passing in the metaphorical night, except they were on a space station, and neither of them were ships, and the metaphor was getting away from him, because he was clearly more tired than he'd realized. Sleep came easily, dreamless and deep, the kind of rest that came from knowing exactly where you stood in the universe and what your responsibilities were, and having no ambitions beyond fixing things that were broken. He woke to his alarm at 0600, ran through his morning routine with mechanical efficiency, and headed to the main concourse for coffee before his shift started. The concourse at this hour was relatively quiet, occupied mostly by early shift workers and the occasional insomniac staring into their drinks with the haunted expression of someone who'd made poor life choices. Rowan ordered his usual black coffee, double shot, nothing fancy, and was waiting for the beverage dispenser to finish its process when he overheard the conversation at the table behind him. Princess Nythara finally made her declaration, someone was saying. their voice carrying the particular tone of someone sharing gossip they found absolutely delicious. After all these years. About time, another voice responded, though I heard it's caused quite a stir back on the Vel'Karian homeworld. Apparently her choice is considered rather unconventional. Unconventional? The man isn't even Vel'Karian, he's human. Some engineer named Rowan Cross. The coffee cup slipped from Rowan's suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered against the dispenser tray, spraying hot liquid across his hand. He barely noticed. Rowan spent the next 48 hours convincing himself that he'd misheard, that there was another Rowan Cross somewhere on Europa Station, who was far more qualified to be mysteriously engaged to alien royalty. This desperate hope died screaming when station security appeared at his workstation in Section 7, politely but firmly requesting his presence at a diplomatic meeting. "Is this about the atmospheric processing delays?" Rowan asked, already mentally reviewing whether he'd filed all the correct paperwork. "Because I submitted the maintenance schedule 3 days ahead of deadline, and the efficiency drop is within acceptable parameters according to." "This isn't about atmospheric processing, Mr. Cross," the taller security officer said, managing to make it sound both reassuring and ominous simultaneously. The diplomatic meeting room existed in a part of the station Rowan had only seen in orientation videos. All polished surfaces and furniture that probably cost more than his annual salary, with a conference table made from some kind of wood that definitely hadn't come from Earth. The viewport here showed an unobstructed view of Jupiter, which would have been impressive if Rowan wasn't too busy panicking to appreciate it. Princess Nythara sat at the head of the table like she'd been born to occupy expensive furniture, flanked by 2 advisors whose expressions suggested they'd recently bitten into something sour. She looked exactly as he remembered from the gala, impossibly elegant, with those striking pointed ears and dark hair that seemed to absorb light. When she saw him enter, her face brightened with genuine pleasure, as if he just made her entire day by existing. "Rowan," she said, his name sounding musical in her accent, "please sit." "I think there's been a mistake," Rowan blurted out, remaining standing because sitting felt like accepting something he absolutely did not want to accept. "A really, really big mistake. We've never even spoken before. I don't know you. You don't know me. I'm nobody important. I calibrate air filters and fix coolant leaks and occasionally argue with maintenance bots about optimal recycling schedules. There's no possible universe where this makes sense." One of the advisors, a severe-looking man whose own ears marked him as Vel'Karian, cleared his throat. "Your Highness, perhaps if you explained." "I saw it in his smile," Nythara interrupted softly, her gaze never leaving Rowan's face. 3 nights ago across the Grand Hall, the cashiera, the smile of recognition. Rowan felt his brain trying to process this information and failing spectacularly. "The what?" "I smiled because you were looking at me and I didn't want to be rude. I smile at people all the time. The coffee vendor, the maintenance supervisor. Yesterday I smiled at a Thromalian delegate because they said something that might have been a joke, though honestly I'm still not sure because their language doesn't translate humor well." "The cashiera is not mere courtesy," Nythara explained with the patience of someone discussing orbital mechanics with a child. "Among my people, bonded pairs recognize each other through a specific exchange, a moment of perfect understanding that transcends conscious intention. It happens once in a lifetime when 2 souls see each other truly. I have been waiting for that moment for many years, and then I saw you and I knew." "You knew," Rowan repeated slowly. "You knew from a smile, one smile. Across a crowded room, from someone you'd never met." "Yes, that's insane." The advisor winced. The other advisor, a woman with silver jewelry woven through her hair, made a small noise that might have been suppressed laughter. Nythara's expression didn't change, maintaining that serene certainty that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. "I understand this is difficult for humans to accept," she said. Your species has lost touch with many deeper truths in your focus on empirical measurement. But your understanding is not required for the bond to exist. I have declared it, and among my people, that makes it reality. Rowan felt like he'd fallen into one of Jupiter's storm systems and was being spun in circles by atmospheric pressure differentials. Okay, let's approach this logically. I don't want to marry you. No offense, I'm sure you're great, you seem very nice, definitely out of my league, but I don't want to marry anyone I don't know. Doesn't my opinion count for something? Of course your opinion matters, Nythara said gently. You simply don't understand your own heart yet. You will. I'm pretty sure I understand my own heart, Rowan protested. It's been with me for 32 years. We're well acquainted. The heart knows truths the mind hasn't discovered yet. She said it like she was stating something as obvious as gravity or thermodynamics, a fundamental law of the universe that required no proof. Rowan turned to the advisors desperately. Help me out here. This is crazy, right? You can't just declare someone your future spouse because they smiled at you once. The male advisor shifted uncomfortably. The Kashara is considered sacred and absolute in Vel'Karian culture. Once declared, a bond has never been successfully dissolved in our recorded history. Never, Rowan's voice climbed an octave, not once, in your entire civilization's history. The bond is recognized, not created, the female advisor explained, though she sounded almost sympathetic. Princess Nythara believes she has identified her bonded partner. Such declarations are treated as statements of observed fact, not expressions of preference. But I'm human. I don't even have this Kashara thing. It's not part of my biology or culture or anything. The bond transcends species, Nythara said calmly. It exists in the realm of what you might call the soul, though that's an imprecise translation. Your biology is irrelevant. Rowan pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to ward off the headache building behind them. This cannot be happening. I have a staff meeting in 40 minutes. I have 3 maintenance requests that need approval. There's a cooling system in Junction 12 that's developing a persistent leak. I don't have time for a cosmic bonding crisis. The cooling system leak should be your priority, Nythara agreed, surprising him. I would never interfere with your professional responsibilities. I simply wanted to meet you properly, now that our bond is formally declared. Our bond that I don't agree exists. Your agreement isn't required for truth to be truth. She stood gracefully, moving around the table toward him. Rowan resisted the urge to back away. I know this is overwhelming. Take time to process. We have our whole lives ahead of us. We don't have lives ahead of us, Rowan said desperately. We have me going back to work and you doing whatever princesses do, and us never seeing each other again, because this is all a huge misunderstanding. Nythara reached out and gently touched his hand. Her fingers were cool and her skin impossibly soft, and Rowan felt something electric run up his arm that was probably just panic. I look forward to seeing you again, Rowan Cross. Perhaps at tomorrow's infrastructure review meeting. I've developed quite an interest in station environmental systems. She swept out of the room with her advisors trailing behind her, leaving Rowan standing alone in the expensive meeting room with Jupiter swirling indifferently outside the viewport, and his entire understanding of reality crumbling around his ears. He made it back to his quarters before completely losing his composure, pacing the small space like a caged animal, while his mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios. He could request a transfer to literally anywhere else in human space. He could hide in the maintenance tunnels until this whole thing blew over. He could change his name and take up a new identity as an asteroid miner in the outer belt where alien princesses presumably didn't visit. The transfer request took him an hour to compose, trying to word it professionally while internally screaming. He submitted it with shaking hands and waited for the confirmation that would signal his escape from this nightmare. The denial came back in 6 minutes. Enhanced security clearance required for the future consort of a visiting dignitary. Transfer requests temporarily suspended pending diplomatic resolution. Rowan stared at the message until the words stopped making sense, then did what any rational person would do in his situation. He went to bed at 7 in the evening and pulled the covers over his head, hoping that sleep might reset reality into something that made sense. It didn't work. He woke at 3 in the morning from dreams of smiling at strangers who then declared eternal bonds, attended his staff meeting in a fog of exhaustion and existential dread, and spent the day trying to focus on coolant flows and air recycling, while his brain kept circling back to the absolute impossibility of his situation. The infrastructure review meeting happened at 1400 hours in conference room 6. Rowan attended because missing it would require explaining why, and he absolutely did not want to explain any of this to his supervisor. He slid into his usual seat near the back, prepared to discuss atmospheric processing upgrades and nothing else. Princess Nythara arrived 10 minutes into the meeting, accompanied by a small security detail and an aide who carried what appeared to be an actual paper notebook. She took a seat near the front and listened attentively as the station's chief engineer droned through efficiency statistics and maintenance projections. Rowan spent the entire meeting trying to become invisible through sheer force of will. It almost worked until the chief engineer opened the floor for questions and observations. Nythara raised her hand. "I have a question for Engineer Cross, if he's available." Every head in the room turned toward Rowan, who seriously considered throwing himself out the nearest airlock. "Yes," he managed. "The carbon recycling metrics you mentioned in your report. I'm curious about the efficiency improvements you've projected for the next quarter. They seem optimistic, given the current system limitations." It was an actual, legitimate technical question. Rowan found himself answering on autopilot, discussing catalyst replacement schedules and processing algorithms, while part of his brain marveled that she'd apparently actually read his report. They had a back-and-forth about thermal efficiency that lasted almost 5 minutes, and Nythara's questions were sharp and insightful in ways that suggested genuine understanding. Then the meeting ended, and as people filed out, Nythara caught his arm gently. "You're very knowledgeable," she said warmly. "I'm constantly impressed by your expertise, my intended." Every single person within earshot stopped walking. Rowan felt his face burning hot enough to register on thermal sensors. I'm not, that's not," he stammered. Nythara smiled that same radiant smile from the gala, squeezed his arm affectionately, and glided away, leaving Rowan standing in a conference room full of colleagues whose expressions ranged from shock to barely contained amusement. His supervisor approached, fighting a grin. "So, Prince Rowan, that's quite a development." Rowan closed his eyes and wondered if it was too late to become an asteroid miner after all. Rowan's life became a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance that would have impressed professional escape artists. He changed his coffee schedule, alternated his routes through the station's corridors, and started taking meals at random intervals that no sane person would choose for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. For 3 glorious days, it almost worked. Then he walked into the seldom-used observation deck in the lower residential ring at 06:30 on a Tuesday morning and found Princess Nythara already there, watching Earth rise over Europa's horizon with a cup of something steaming in her hands. "I enjoy this view," she said without turning around. "The way your homeworld catches the light, it must be strange being so far from where you began." Rowan considered backing out slowly, but she'd clearly already heard him enter. "How did you know I'd be here?" "I didn't, but I've noticed you prefer the quieter observation decks, and this one has the best view during the early rotation cycle. It seemed a reasonable hypothesis." She turned to smile at him. "Would you like some tea? I brought extra just in case." "Just in case you ran into your alleged future husband in a random observation deck at dawn." "Alleged?" She sounded amused. "You have a gift for denial that's almost admirable. Yes, would you like some?" Against his better judgment, Rowan accepted the offered cup. The tea tasted like flowers and something else he couldn't identify, warm and oddly soothing. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Earth's blue curve against the black, and Rowan felt his carefully maintained panic subsiding into something more manageable. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Anything. But what happens if you're wrong? What if this Kashara thing doesn't actually work across species? Or what if I really was just being polite? Or what if you saw something that wasn't there?" Nythara considered this seriously, tilting her head in that way she had. What happens to a star if gravity is wrong? What happens to a planet if orbital mechanics don't function? Some truths are fundamental. They don't require belief to exist. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. She took a sip of her tea. "I understand you find this frightening. I would be frightened too in your position. But I also know what I saw in your smile, Rowan Cross, and I've never been wrong about something that mattered." "There's a first time for everything," Rowan muttered, but without much conviction. His week deteriorated from there. Nythara appeared at the maintenance bay while he was arguing with a particularly stubborn waste processing unit, offered an insight about flow dynamics that actually solved the problem, then mentioned to his supervisor that she was so proud of her intended's dedication to his work. She attended an entirely different infrastructure meeting and still managed to reference their future together while discussing water reclamation percentages. She sent him a gift, a small crystalline sculpture that rotated slowly in midair through some technology he couldn't identify, beautiful and completely baffling. "Just embrace it, man," his colleague Tors said, watching Rowan stare at the floating sculpture like it might explode. "Princess wants to marry you. That's not actually a problem most people would run from." "But she doesn't know me," Rowan protested. "We've barely spoken. This whole thing is based on one accidental smile and some mystical bonding nonsense that doesn't even exist in human culture." "But maybe that's the problem," Tors suggested. "Maybe humans just forgot how to recognize the good stuff when we see it. We're so busy measuring and analyzing that we miss the obvious." "The obvious being that an alien princess," I smiled at once, "definitely wants to spend her life with me." "When you say it like that, it does sound weird," Tors admitted. "But have you actually talked to her? Like, really talked? She seemed pretty sharp in that meeting, when she solved your thermal efficiency problem." Rowan wanted to argue, but couldn't quite manage it. Nythara was sharp. Every interaction he'd had with her, beneath the terrifying certainty about their supposed bond, revealed someone with a quick mind and genuine curiosity. She'd read his maintenance reports, for crying out loud. Who read maintenance reports unless they had to? His friend Keisha found him in the station's small library annex 2 days later, surrounded by data tablets displaying everything the human databases had on Vel'Karian culture. She dropped into the seat across from him with 2 coffee bulbs and a sympathetic expression. "How's the research going?" "Terribly," Rowan said, gesturing at the tablets. "Everything confirms what she told me. The Kashara is considered absolute. Once declared, it's treated as observed reality, not opinion. There are entire legal frameworks built around bonded pairs, and apparently it's never been wrong in recorded Vel'Karian history, which is about 8,000 years of documentation. But never, not once, every declared bond has resulted in a successful pairing. The closest thing to dissolution happens when one partner dies, and even then, the surviving partner usually never bonds again." He scrubbed his hands through his hair. "Either their entire civilization has been collectively delusional for millennia, or there's actually something to this. Or," Keisha said carefully, "the cultural expectation is so strong that people make it work regardless of the initial truth." "But that's not comforting." "It wasn't meant to be." She sipped her coffee. "For what it's worth, I've seen you two together, at that infrastructure meeting last week. The way she looks at you isn't crazy, Rowan, it's certain. There's a difference." "But certain that she's right about something I know is wrong." "Are you sure you know it's wrong, or are you just scared?" Rowan didn't have an answer for that, which was answer enough. The situation reached critical mass on station day 16 of what Rowan had started mentally calling the princess problem. He'd been summoned to a formal state dinner, actual gilt-edged invitation delivered by a diplomatic courier, no polite way to refuse without causing an incident. He'd tried anyway. His supervisor had physically prevented him from filing another transfer request while laughing so hard she'd nearly cried. The dinner was an exercise in elegant torture. Rowan found himself seated at a table with various dignitaries, whose names he immediately forgot, making awkward small talk about station operations, while trying not to look at the head table where Nythara held court. She wore something that shimmered when she moved, and her laugh carried across the room like music, and Rowan caught himself watching her navigate complex political discussions with the same grace she brought to everything else. She was brilliant. That was the problem. He'd spent 2 weeks trying to dismiss her as delusional, but every interaction proved she was anything but. She was sharp and thoughtful and genuinely kind, and the way she smiled when she saw him made something in his chest do complicated things that he absolutely refused to analyze. Halfway through the main course, something that had been alive on 3 different planets before being combined into an unholy fusion cuisine, the human ambassador arrived, fashionably late and full of apologies. Nythara rose to greet him with perfect diplomatic poise, and Rowan saw his chance. "Ambassador Chen, such a pleasure," Nythara said warmly. "May I introduce Rowan Cross, my future husband, and an absolutely brilliant environmental systems engineer." The ambassador's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. The entire table went silent. Somewhere in the back of the hall, Rowan heard someone drop a serving implement. "Your future," the ambassador started. "Yes," Nythara confirmed, radiating serene confidence. "We're bonded through the Kashara. It's all very traditional, though I understand it must seem unusual from a human perspective." Rowan wanted the floor to open up and swallow him into the cold vacuum of space. The ambassador recovered his composure with admirable speed, offering congratulations that sounded genuine even if his eyes held profound confusion. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of increasingly awkward conversations, where people kept congratulating Rowan on something he'd never agreed to, while he seriously contemplated the viability of living in the maintenance tunnels permanently. Later, as guests filed out toward the reception area, Rowan found himself cornered by Nythara near one of the viewports. She looked pleased with herself, which somehow made everything worse. "Did you enjoy the dinner?" "You introduced me to an Earth ambassador as your future husband," Rowan said flatly. "An actual ambassador, from Earth, who definitely reports these things to people who matter. I introduced you as what you are." "I'm not," he stopped, took a breath, tried again. "Nythara, your highness, princess, I need you to understand something. I'm not playing hard to get. I'm not in denial. I don't feel this bond you're talking about. I smiled at you because you seemed nice and I was trying to be polite. And somehow that's turned into this entire thing that I never wanted or asked for." For the first time since he'd met her, Nythara's certainty flickered. Something vulnerable crossed her face, quickly hidden. "You truly feel nothing." "I feel confused and overwhelmed, and like my life has been hijacked by forces beyond my control," Rowan said honestly. "I feel like you're a genuinely impressive person who deserves someone who actually wants to be with them, not someone who's trying to figure out how to escape to the outer belt and take up asteroid mining." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at Jupiter's swirling storms. "Among my people, we're taught that the Kashara is mutual recognition. Both souls see each other simultaneously, but perhaps—" She paused. "Perhaps I saw something you didn't. Or perhaps human souls speak differently than Vel'Karian ones." It was the first crack in her absolute conviction, and Rowan felt something like relief mixed with unexpected guilt. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize for being honest." She turned back to him, and her smile was sadder than he'd seen before. "I waited many years for that moment at the gala, Rowan Cross. Years of formal functions and diplomatic encounters, searching faces for something I couldn't name. And then I saw you smile, and everything I'd been taught told me I'd found what I was looking for. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps human hearts work differently than Vel'Karian ones, but I don't know how to stop believing what I saw in your eyes. Before Rowan could respond, though he had no idea what he would have said, an alarm shrieked through the station's PA system, harsh and urgent. All personnel, security alert level 3. Diplomatic guests proceed immediately to designated safe zones. This is not a drill. Nythara's expression shifted from vulnerable to alert in an instant. Her security detail materialized from nowhere, surrounding her with practiced efficiency. One of them was speaking rapidly into a communication device, their face grim. "Your Highness, we need to move. Now." Rowan stood frozen as chaos erupted around him, guests streaming toward exits while security personnel appeared in force. And through it all, Nythara looked at him once more with those deep space eyes, something unreadable in her expression before her guards swept her away into the controlled panic of an emergency evacuation. The secure location turned out to be a reinforced conference room in the station's central core, designed to withstand everything from hull breaches to targeted attacks. Rowan found himself shoved through the door along with a dozen other civilians who'd been too close to the diplomatic wing when the alarm sounded, all of them wearing various expressions of confusion and fear. He was still processing the transition from awkward dinner conversation to emergency lockdown when he saw Nythara across the room, surrounded by her advisors who were arguing in rapid Vel'Karian that the translation implants couldn't quite keep up with. "We must rescind the declaration," the male advisor was insisting. "The traditionalist faction has made their position clear. Your choice threatens the stability of the entire succession." "I will not betray the Kashera," Nythara said quietly but with steel underneath. "Not for politics, not for safety, not for anything. Your Highness, please be reasonable. I saw what I saw, I know what I know. That doesn't change because others disapprove." Rowan felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. She was facing actual danger because of her absolute belief in something he'd spent weeks denying, and she wasn't backing down. It was either the bravest or most stubborn thing he'd ever witnessed, and he couldn't quite decide which. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Station security officers were sealing the doors, checking atmospheric integrity, doing all the things that Rowan's engineer brain recognized as serious emergency protocol. This wasn't a drill or a false alarm. Something had actually gone wrong. What happened? Someone asked a security officer near the door. Attempted poisoning at the dinner. Princess Nythara's food taster collapsed. We're sweeping for additional threats and securing all diplomatic guests until we confirm the situation is contained. Rowan's blood went cold. He looked at Nythara, who had gone very still, her advisors now speaking in urgent whispers that weren't really whispers at all. "This is about the human," the female advisor was saying. "The traditionalists can't accept her bonding outside our species. They'll keep trying until they succeed or I renounce him," Nythara finished. "I understand the stakes." "Then renounce him. Your Highness, this is madness. One human engineer is not worth your life." Rowan expected to feel relief at that sentiment. Instead, he felt something closer to offense, which was ridiculous given that he'd been trying to escape this entire situation for weeks. But hearing someone dismiss him as not worth dying for, while Nythara stood there refusing to abandon her conviction about their supposed bond, it did strange things to his perspective. The situation deteriorated with impressive speed. Alarms began blaring in a different pattern, the kind that made Rowan's engineering instincts scream danger. One of the security officers was shouting into their communicator about unauthorized access to the maintenance tunnels, and Rowan felt his stomach drop because he knew those tunnels. He'd mapped them himself for the atmospheric system upgrades, and if someone with hostile intent had those maps. "They're coming through the service ducts," he said, loud enough to cut through the rising panic. Junction 47 connects directly to this section through the emergency ventilation system. If they have the access codes. He didn't finish because an explosion rocked the room, small but precise, blowing out one of the wall panels in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. 3 figures in tactical gear poured through before the smoke cleared, weapons raised, and everything became screaming chaos. Rowan moved on instinct, grabbing the nearest person and pulling them behind a conference table as energy weapons discharged with sounds like tearing reality. His brain shifted into the hyper-focused mode it adopted during emergency repairs, cataloging exits and options with mechanical precision. The main door was blocked by security officers engaging the attackers. The ventilation panel they'd blown was too small for most people, but maybe not for someone desperate. The emergency access port in the corner led to the maintenance sublevel, which connected to this way. He found himself pulling people toward the corner, his hands moving across the access panel's controls with practiced familiarity. The security codes he'd been given for maintenance work still functioned, and the panel slid open to reveal a narrow shaft descending into darkness. Nythara was suddenly beside him, her guards forming a protective barrier as more explosions echoed through the room. "You know where this goes. Maintenance sublevel. Then we can access the emergency corridors that security doesn't monitor because they're technically not rated for personnel traffic, but they'll hold if we're careful." He was already climbing into the shaft, reaching back to help others follow. "Come on." They descended into the guts of the station, a tight press of terrified civilians and frustrated security personnel who'd been trained for threats that came through doors, not ventilation systems. Rowan led them through passages he'd crawled through dozens of times while checking sensor arrays and coolant lines, his hands finding holds in the darkness automatically while his mind raced through the station's layout. "There's a cargo bay 3 sections over," he said, helping Nythara navigate a particularly tight corner where a coolant pipe reduced the clearance to barely shoulder width. "We can seal it from inside and call for backup." "You've spent a lot of time in these tunnels," Nythara observed, surprisingly calm for someone who'd nearly been assassinated twice in one evening. "Someone has to maintain the systems that keep everyone breathing." They emerged into a slightly wider corridor, and Rowan paused to orient himself. "Why do I keep helping you? You're the reason I'm in danger in the first place." "Because you're kind," Nythara said simply. "It's what I saw in your smile. Not just politeness, genuine kindness that extends even to delusional princesses who have complicated your life." "I didn't say delusional. You were thinking it." She smiled despite everything, that radiant expression that had started this entire mess. "You think it every time you look at me, wondering how someone so certain could be so wrong." They reached the cargo bay through a maintenance hatch that deposited them near the loading mechanisms. Rowan sealed the main doors and activated the emergency communication system, while the others caught their breath and checked for injuries. No one was seriously hurt, though several people looked like they'd been through a centrifuge, and Nythara's elegant dress was torn and stained with something that looked like hydraulic fluid. "Station security, this is Rowan Cross in Cargo Bay 7 Beta. We have approximately 15 civilians including Princess Nythara. The attackers breached Conference Room 12 through the maintenance access. We need immediate extraction and medical." The response came through after a tense moment. Help was coming. The attackers had been neutralized. The station was secure. They just needed to wait for the all-clear. In the strange quiet that followed, surrounded by shipping containers and cargo loading equipment, Rowan found himself sitting on the deck next to Nythara while her advisors fussed over her, and the other civilians shared water rations and nervous laughter. His hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading and he couldn't quite catch his breath properly. "Why did you help me?" Nythara asked quietly, echoing his earlier question. "You could have left me to my guards. They're trained for protection. You're trained for air filters and coolant systems." Because nobody deserves to die for following their heart, Rowan said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Even if their heart is completely wrong about awkward engineers who just wanted to fix atmospheric processors in peace. Is my heart wrong? She looked at him with those impossible eyes, and Rowan saw real vulnerability there. You truly believe I've imagined everything? He thought about the past weeks, about her absolute certainty in the face of his denial, her refusal to back down even when it put her life at risk. He thought about how she'd read his maintenance reports and asked intelligent questions about thermal efficiency, how her smile made something in his chest do complicated gymnastics, how right now, covered in hydraulic fluid and sitting on a cargo bay floor after nearly dying twice, she was still looking at him like he mattered. I don't know what I believe, he admitted, but I know you're genuine. I know you saw something in that smile, something real enough to risk everything for. And I know that when I thought those attackers might hurt you, I stopped caring about whether I believed in mystical bonding and started caring about keeping you safe. That's a start, Nythara said softly. A start to what? To your heart catching up to what it recognized before your mind could. She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and took his hand. Her fingers were still cool, still impossibly soft, and Rowan found he didn't want to let go. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Rowan Cross. I'm asking you to stop running long enough to see what happens when you let yourself be seen. Security arrived before Rowan could respond, flooding the cargo bay with personnel and medical teams and all the organized chaos of emergency response. They were escorted back to secure quarters, debriefed separately, checked for injuries and shock. The station buzzed with news of the attempted assassination and the brave engineer who'd saved the princess by leading her through maintenance tunnels. Rowan's supervisor called him at 3 in the morning to alternately congratulate him and threaten him with paperwork if he damaged any critical systems during his unauthorized personnel transport through maintenance areas. When things finally settled, nearly 2 days after the attack, Rowan found Nythara in that same observation deck where she'd offered him tea. She looked tired but unharmed, watching Europa's surface scroll pass below them. They arrested 7 conspirators, she said when he joined her. All members of the traditionalist faction who believed my choice threatened the purity of our bloodline. My advisors still want me to renounce you. Are you going to? No. She smiled. Are you going to keep insisting I'm wrong about us? Rowan considered this carefully. I'm going to stop running. I'm going to get to know you, actually know you, not just as the terrifying princess who hijacked my life. And if this Kashara thing is real, if there's actually something between us worth finding, then maybe my heart will figure out what you claim it already knows. And if it doesn't, then at least I'll have made a friend who appreciates thermal efficiency reports. That's pretty rare. Nythara laughed, that bell-like sound that made something warm bloom in Rowan's chest. I suppose that is a start. Though for what it's worth, I remain certain about what I saw in your smile. Yeah, Rowan said, and found himself smiling at her. Not the polite smile of a stranger, but something deeper and more honest. I'm starting to suspect you might not be entirely wrong about that. She smiled back, radiant and certain, and Rowan thought that maybe, possibly, his heart had known something his mind was only now beginning to understand. It wasn't Kashara or mystical recognition, or anything he could measure or quantify. It was simpler and more complicated than that. It was possibility, opening like a flower in vacuum, unlikely and impossible, and somehow blooming anyway.